Hey, hey, I have the perfect idea.
Okay, talk to me.
Let's make the Little Mermaid black.
Oh my God, why didn't we think of this sooner?
Really?
No, you dumb We need more representation. Representation.
I think it's safe to say that when it comes to live-action remakes, Disney has been on nothing short of a derailing train hot on the ESG tracks to bumfrick nowhere. Over the style and substance that created those original classics, we've instead been gifted a parade of non-stop green screens, shoddy CGI, and so much rewriting for the sake of representation that you'd think Africans discovered America and owned slaves. Oh wait, they want you to forget that second one ever happened. Disney's live-action adaptation of The Little Mermaid does very little to resurrect the hopes that all those previous live-action remakes brutally drowned. The film opens with a quote from Hans Christian Andersen, the Danish author that penned the original Little Mermaid tale, which Disney repurposed for its 1989 animated film, of which was then repurposed again for this remake. The quote reads, "But a mermaid has no tears, and therefore she suffers so much more." Because, oh my gosh, guys, we have to really explicitly set out the not-so-subtle underlying themes of this film so that moving forward, you don't forget what Ariel's real motivations are. In comes Prince Eric aboard a Voyager with his insanely diverse crew members who are trying to spear what they believe is a mermaid, but is actually a lone dolphin. I'll give the writers some credit here, as rather than being almost a background character in the cartoon film, they do attempt to build up Eric more by making him essentially a male version of Ariel. Shackled by the pieties of living a privileged royal lifestyle where they aren't given a whole lot of freedom, aside from literally sailing the seven seas. But hey, who am I to question that, right? To try and provide some sort of historical accuracy, they work into the dialogue that there's some Spaniard ships exploring somewhere nearby. I'll circle back to this. Now, a lot of people are probably going to disagree with me on this one, but the movie didn't start out completely bad. For the first 20-odd minutes, it did seem like I was basically watching a heartless rendition of the animated classic. Emphasis on heartless. They show Ariel exploring the abandoned shipwreck, escaping the clutches of a vicious shark, and introduce us to King Triton, played by Javier Bardem, and Ariel's sisters, who are all of different ethnicities despite having a Hispanic father and the same mother.
Right.
Obvious ESG checkmarks aside, it goes straight downhill after the first musical number, the classic Part of Your World. As much as many other sources have claimed, there's no lyrical change to this song. Even as Halle Bailey sings it out on screen, the visual rendition is almost identical to the animated film. The only problem, and one that plagues every musical number in this film, it has no heart. As much as Bailey tries to put her own spin on the song, it instead comes off as an extremely poor imitation of what Jodie Benson had done almost 35 years earlier. And to top it off, her expressions carry nearly none of the emotion her lyrics or voice are attempting to get across. In fact, it becomes even clearer that she was cast as a subpar vocal replacement that perfectly checks off the "more representation" box.
Okay, let's see my to-do list.
Anyways, after that long, drawn-out, kinda cringe fest, Ariel sees some fireworks from the top of her cave hole and, despite her father's wishes, swims to the surface to investigate. Above, Eric and his crew are having a birthday celebration for him. Fireworks, drinks, and peg-legged dancing galore. Again, they reinforce his desire to be just as free as Ariel by having him have a sidebar conversation with Grimsby, his caretaker, stepfather, advisor? I have no idea who this dude is, except that he's surprisingly portrayed by Art Malik. Is brown as hell, and that it's here it becomes painfully obvious that the film is a diversity revision instead of a genuine reimagining of the animated classic many of us grew up adoring. The diversity is what plagues a lot of this adaptation unnecessarily. Since Eric is actually a developed character, we find out that his mother, who is black as hell by the way, is actually the queen of this settlement, and to explain why her son is the color of a country picket fence, it turns out Eric was found on a wreck as a boy and she adopted him. No mention of any father by the way, and now they're mother and child.
What?
Did I mention that his mom is also posh as hell, therefore giving her an accent that makes absolutely no sense for the time period or geographic location? Anyways, a sudden storm, crew members panicking, shit goes haywire, crew escapes, Eric gets yeeted off the boat, and that's when Ariel intervenes, saving Eric from drowning and dragging him to shore. In the basking glory of the morning sunrise, she tries to wake him up and successfully does by pretty much poking him incessantly in the chest and humming her siren song. Now, the animated original, when Eric regains consciousness, is very clear that he sees Ariel. But here, to add realism, my guess, he just sees a blur with eyes set wide enough it might as well have been Sid from Ice Age lurking over him. A jump to the next scene, Triton and his daughters are cleaning up the wreckage from Eric's ship, which has strewn a bunch of shit all over their reef home. Insert a not-so-sly environmental message in which all humans do is destroy their home, and that for the reef to recoup, it'll take 1,000 years at least. I actually facepalmed in the theater at this tidbit of a line, as it's a gross exaggeration. Scientifically, it's been proven that corals take up to 12 years on average to bounce back from extreme storm damage or even bleaching. Now, considering that this is set in the 1600s, where there is a far smaller global human population, far less ocean disturbance by humans, and a completely different atmosphere, both above and below the surface, these corals would probably bounce back even quicker. Just saying. After this scene, we get introduced to our villain, Ursula, who in this version is Triton's sister and played by Melissa McCarthy.
It's coming out of me like lava!
Now, I'll admit, for about 30 seconds, I was like, hey, she ain't bad casting. But the same thing that plagues the rest of this adaptation sets in. No heart. She's just kind of evil for the sake of being evil, and her motivations for spying on Ariel are more or less the same as the animated classic, just less directly stated or implied for the sake of giving McCarthy more screen time. Our second musical interlude comes in here with Under the Sea. And bloody hell, I really didn't think you could create such a bland visual interlude for a banger of a song. While Sebastian is one of the few things this adaptation gets kind of right, they butcher Under the Sea by not really understanding why we were so drawn to that song in the first place. Disney animated classics have the freedom to animate scenes that perfectly match the lyrics, thus giving the songs not only more weight, but more impact, as now we have a sense-based memory to tie it all together. This rendition was so poorly orchestrated, I genuinely wanted to cry in the theater. They up the color visually compared to the rest of the movie, but what we see on screen doesn't match up with any of the lyrics. And as a result, you end up experiencing a complete disconnect. For example, the verse where Sebastian sings, the newt play the flute, the carp play the harp, the place play the bass, and the sounding sharp, the bass play the brass, the chub play the tub, the fluke is the Duke of Soul. This has no visual lineup to make the purpose of the song hit even harder for not only Ariel, but for the audience. They also CGI in a lot of sea creatures that the target audience wouldn't be familiar with, creating what basically looks like the silly string celebration scene from Legally Blonde. From here, the plot kind of continues along the lines of the 1989 classic. Triton thinks that Ariel is in love, he questions Sebastian about it, who reveals that she actually went to the surface and saved Eric. Triton finds her treasure trove, destroys it, Sebastian feels bad, and then Ursula's eels, Flotsam and Jetsam, who oddly aren't named despite Ursula having love for them, lead Ariel to Ursula's lair, and meanwhile Eric is prancing about on land, ordering the kingdom to find the black blur that rescued him from death. Now, recall how all the promotional images for this film showed us dark, unimaginative CGI backgrounds? There were instances where color did shine through pretty nicely. And then there's instances like this scene where the intent was sinister, but it doesn't even register when you consider that they made King Triton's kingdom, which was a shining gold dick beacon in the 1989 film, into a coral-covered turd that looks as though they've been floating in a truck stop bathroom off the I-90. I honestly couldn't discern what was obviously evil and obviously good environments because of this attempt at realism. So while the giant mosasaur skeleton was kind of cool, there were no creepy souls, not a whole lot of malice, and just a whole bunch of squinting to figure out what the hell I was looking at in her lair. And here's where we have the absolute heartbreaking rendition of Poor Unfortunate Souls come in. I really can't emphasize how they absolutely butchered this song and its purpose in this scene and part of the movie. Much like Under the Sea, the imagery does not support Ursula's lyrics, and while the vocals themselves are pretty good, Ursula herself has no oomph. They also edit a lot of her song falling out, which further creates this sense of disconnect as well as fails to paint her villainous intentions as clear. Ariel accepts the terms, Ursula steals her voice, and she swims to the surface alongside Sebastian and Flounder and is netted up by a lone fisherman. Now I know this is a Disney film, so it's meant to be all family friendly, but for frick's sake, there's no way in hell that a lone male fisherman, who's probably been out at sea for a hot minute, is just gonna be polite as hell to a soppy, fully naked, attractive woman with no voice. I mean, come on. We all know what sailors were doing around this time period. I would have much rather they just let Scuttle find a rag on a wrecked area nearby since, apparently in this universe, humans be polluting and shit like no tomorrow. Oh, by the way, did you know that they gender swapped Scuttle with a talentless, clearly hired for her ethnicity gender studies grad? Whoever gave this woman a career deserves to be thrown in the bin.
Know your fucking place, trash.
Moving along, here is where we get the greatest deviation from the animated source, as the writers attempt to develop a more organic relationship between Ariel and Eric since the terms of Ariel's contract with Ursula have also slightly changed. Instead of getting true love's kiss within 3 days, she'll also have no memory of that specific stipulation. It's a nice evil twist, but one that you easily forget about as they make it pretty clear that there's a base attraction between Ariel and Eric in this long-winded, poorly paced, and boring attempt at a romantic interlude. For realsies, there's so much of nothing that happens in this act of the film that I could hear my local audience getting bored. The most interesting part of this whole section of the film is how obvious the representation comes into play. There's the black single mother queen of this colony, her brown advisor, and aside from one maid and Eric, there are no white people in this castle whatsoever. When Ariel and Eric go out exploring and end up in a shanty town of this colonized Caribbean nation, the entire shanty town is full of white people, save for a handful of musicians during the cringy, over-the-top choreographed dance sequence. Legit, keep your eyes open because they make sure dem whiteys get put in their place in this movie. There's also a fun little cameo of Jodie Benson, Ariel's original voice actress, included here as well. Alright folks, are you ready? Because here's where we segue into perhaps this IP's most iconic song, Kiss the Girl. The lagoon this all happens in is just as drab as many of the other scenes prior, and same thing, this song is butchered just as badly as the other classic ones. No imagery to match the lyrics, no resounding excitement about the potential romance that will take its next step, no twinkle in our hearts over the swooning this scene would give us as girls, as children. Honestly, I don't even know what the point of keeping this song in because they strip it down to about 6 or 7 lines repeated and make sure that if you choose to kiss someone when there is an obvious attraction, you still gotta use your words and Oscar.
What the fuck is this?
Are you bleeping kidding me? Hey ladies, despite what modern culture is telling you, it's not only high tea as hell, but sexy as hell when a dude makes the first move. Can confirm as a day one biological female. Now remember, Ariel is voiceless amidst all this, and Eric doesn't know her name. You wanna know how she gets her name across? By pointing out to the constellations, specifically Aries, something that she would have never known about because she's only been to the surface once in her whole life, and it was during a stormy night where she rescued Eric. So much like the animated original, Flotsam and Jetsam are spying on land Ariel for Ursula and tip over the boat to avoid the couple's almost kiss. Upon witnessing such a close call, Ursula concocts a potion and turns herself into a human, using Ariel's siren voice she acquired earlier to lure Eric into believing she's actually the girl that saved him, and thus hopefully cutting the developing fondness he has for female Mr. Bean. In the animated film, Ursula's human form went by the name Vanessa and was essentially a dark beauty to contrast the innocence of Ariel's demeanor. Now it's just kind of dumbed down to black versus white, and of course, much like some of the other characters we've seen, we gotta make sure all the whites are evil. Vanessa's not named outright, but I gotta say, her casting pissed me off more than anything. Disney and the mob that would have us believe that they're not race swapping for representation, but instead doing it because they're the best fit for the role. Yeah, Halle Bailey directly disproved this one, by the way, shills. And so did the promotion of Black Girl Sunscreen. Vanessa's casting is actually perfect. She's exactly how I would picture the live-action version of her to be. Disney proves with this that they are totally capable of casting the right fits for the live-action versions of their cartoon characters, and that it really is just flippin' representation that takes the helm for characters that many of us adored as children. An entranced Eric has now offered Vanessa his hand in marriage, and the rumor spreads around the castle, destroying a love-stricken Ariel who's gone off to sob on a rock. Much like the 1989 film, Scuttle goes to spy on Vanessa and finds out that she is indeed Ursula, goes back to tell Ariel, who perks up immediately, and then heads to the castle to break up the celebration that's happening for this newly announced engagement. Tackling ensues, the necklace holding Ariel's siren voice breaks, giving Ariel back her voice, and now since it's the end of the 3-day span of the deal, she turns back into a mermaid. Ursula reverts back to octopus form, Dave, and drags Ariel off a cliff back into the ocean. Triton and his CGI Seps find them, and he gives his power, aka Trident, up in exchange for Ariel's safety, and this dude turns to dust in front of them. Cue the iconic fight scene with a giant Ursula and a painfully obvious imitation of it, as I couldn't see what the hell was going on in this scene as it was so unnecessarily dark. And all it made it think is that I'd seen a near identical scene done far better, CGI, live action and all, in Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End back in 2007. The Calypso battle sequence was very obviously inspired by The Little Mermaid, and while dark and gritty, was visually boisterous enough that you can understand it was a powerful, dark, and evil scene. Ursula's death is nowhere near as impactful as you would hope. While both Eric and Ariel are present during the fight, Eric, the kid who's been sailing the 7 seas as a minor, gets pwned by some ropes, and Ariel, the mermaid that has never in her life worked a functioning ship and been to the surface only once, slithers her way across the deck like a cripple and somehow instinctively knows how a steer works. Cue the underwhelming death of the film's main villain. The Trident is released and Triton is resurrected because that's how magic works in this universe, I guess. Ariel makes a plea about how Eric fought alongside her, and Triton realizes he ought to just listen and give Ariel what she wants, the life of a human. He gives her legs back, she goes back to the surface, and she and Eric are reunited and married. To make the realism tie-in a bit better, the Queen is like, yay, we can finally bridge the gap between our two worlds. They say loft to explore because that's a freedom apparently, and one they both already had, and that's it. That's Disney's live-action adaptation of The Little Mermaid.
Boy.
I bet I'm not alone in stating that this was an absolutely useless live-action remake, and one that would have worked far better as a Pixar film, given the background of half of it. Hell, they could have achieved the brightness and color of the Aquaman film if they had actually tried. The filler story additions are poorly paced and draw out the plot really unnecessarily, while sacrificing more iconic bits like the development of Ursula and Sebastian, who, by the way, has no cool side adventures, and therefore we lose the best song, Les Poissons, from this remake.
Sacre bleu, what is this? How on earth could I miss such a sweet little succulent crab?
The acting is absolutely piss poor, and I don't mean that to shit on it for the sake of shitting on it, it's just genuinely bad. Halle Bailey has her moments, but to be honest, her best acting was done when she was completely silent, which was for half the film. Javier Bardem, who is usually a powerhouse in acting, is underused, and his performance shows that he doesn't really care here. Melissa McCarthy was just her wailing self, and also while she had some instances of good acting, was equally underwhelming as the main antagonist. Sebastian is really the only thing aside from Vanessa they get right, and they wholly nuke the arcs and impact his soft shell self has. The CGI of Flounder and Sebastian is laughable, as again, this is an instance where live action does not work for this particular tale. All I ended up feeling was a craving for Flounder after seeing our once thick boy get reduced down to a grilling fish. The classic songs that are used are poorly imitated, edited to hell, and cut of all impact. And the new original songs added, of which there are 4, 2 by Eric, 1 by Ariel, and 1 by Scuttle.
Remember the swamp? Remember my song in the swamp when I was like, wham, chicka, wham, wham, chicka, wham, wham.
Are forgettable and, quite honestly, replicas of original songs I'd heard in other Disney live-action remakes in recent years. Good lord, the costumes are something that need to be noted here as well. I don't know if it was laziness or an attempt to add brightness to the film, but the costumes are of very poor quality. Again, by contrast, the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, which takes place in roughly the same time period and same geographic location, created far better imitations of the dress worn of the period, and it was far less Halloween costumey. You can see the precision sewing machine stitches along Eric's butt crack and the Queen's dresses. I also don't understand what the purpose of removing the seashell bras was. Maybe it was to sexualize the character less and make her less visually bodacious, but it was a feminine touch to the mermaid characters that I quite honestly loved as a kid, and has made me want a seashell bra ever since. The CGI of scales and representation clothing on Ariel and her sisters is hella cringy and insulting to say the least as someone whose culture is represented by one of these Mer sisters. What bothers me the most out of this adaptation is the painfully obvious race swapping and race representation that I've noted earlier. I know it's been discussed to hell, but I cannot emphasize how much this shatters the experience cinema provides us with. I loved The Little Mermaid as a kid because Ariel was adventurous, exciting, and an actual mermaid. She lived amongst the creatures of the sea, and I dreamed of being her for that reason alone. My adoration for her was in no way dependent on the color of her skin. So while I could forgive this modern adaptation's choice to cast a black Ariel, which made no frickin' sense in the puzzle of diversity they painted throughout this movie, her sisters are all representations that make no sense because they all have the same biological mother and father. Furthermore, not a lot of sunlight penetrates the ocean. It's actually very rare and under very specific circumstances that it can extend more than 1,000 meters below the surface. So, given where the kingdom is located and that Ariel can't go to the surface, and that the darker skin pigmentations of people are usually due to extended sun exposure over many thousands of years, how the hell are any of these mermaids actually black or brown? Then there's the Black Queen adopting a white boy. I'm not here to diss the adoption of different ethnicities, but goodness gracious, it really destroys the immersions when you have to make your audience connect dots rather than enjoy the film. Just make them all black. That way I can focus less on counting your ESG check marks and more on the shite film that you've made. I would imagine that Caribbean and Islander individuals will take some insult to this, as instead of casting actual Islanders for the shantytown scenes, they whitewashed the hell out of it, but still kept the Caribbean culture. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for tuning in and stay frosty, friends.